My name is Olivia Harris, 36 years old, an ordinary high school teacher. Or, at least, that's what my family always believed. But on the day my grandfather passed away, I uncovered a page they had fought to keep hidden, a secret addendum to his will with my name written on it. In that moment, my world shattered and was reborn. Why would the family's so-called outsider be chosen as the true heir? And why were my own blood relatives willing to betray everything to keep it secret? This is not just a story about inheritance. It's a story about truth, betrayal, and the cost of refusing to stay silent when silence would be easier. If you've ever questioned whether family is truly the safest place, stay with me until the very end. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to gently tap that like button and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing these journeys with you. To understand why that single sheet of paper carried the weight of a hammer striking glass, you need to know the people in my family, each of them etched with flaws they never saw in themselves. There was my father, Thomas Harris, a man whose shadow stretched long. Once the golden boy of our town, he clung to reputation like it was oxygen. He spent decades preaching about legacy, but beneath the polished words was a bitterness, an anger that his father, my grandfather, never truly trusted him. My mother, Elaine, moved like a ghost in her own home, her loyalties shifting whichever way the strongest wind of power blew. She taught me early that silence often masquerades as survival. Then there's my older brother David, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and utterly convinced he was destined to inherit everything. To him I was a footnote, a minor character in the epic of his self-importance. And my younger sister Claire, sweet on the surface, but skilled at playing both sides, forever slipping into the role of confidant, only to carry stories where they'd cause the most damage. They all believed the Harris fortune would fall neatly into David's hands, like a crown passed from king to prince. To them, I was nothing more than Olivia, the teacher, the quiet one, the reliable daughter, who asked for little and received even less. But my grandfather, as I would soon discover, saw something none of them ever did. The Harris estate wasn't just a house, it was a monument. A sprawling colonial structure built of brick and quiet intimidation, sitting on the highest hill in town. People would slow their cars just to glimpse the white columns, the manicured hedges, the endless lawn, where generations of Harrises had posed for photographs that ended up in dusty frames and fading newspapers. Inside, the air carried a certain gravity. The smell of old leather-bound books, oak polished so many times it gleamed, and portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. This was the stage where our family played out its dramas, grand celebrations that masked grudges, Sunday dinners where silence was louder than words. The dining room table alone could seat 20, yet somehow it always felt crowded, the weight of expectation pressing down like the chandelier overhead. Every corner of that estate whispered hierarchy. Who belonged? Who didn't? Who sat closest to grandfather at the table, and who was quietly relegated to the edges. For years, I had walked those halls like an outsider in my own bloodline, absorbing every glance that said I was tolerated, not cherished. To the family, the estate was theirs by birthright. To me, it was both prison and proof. Proof of where I came from, prison, because I was never allowed to imagine it as mine. And yet, as fate would reveal, those very walls held the secret that would turn their certainty to dust. I used to think conflict arrived like a storm, loud, sudden, impossible to ignore. But in my family, it was more like a leak in the ceiling. Small drops at first, easily dismissed, until one day the plaster caves in. The first drop fell during the week of my grandfather's funeral. I overheard David in the study, his voice low but sharp, talking to my father. "It's already settled," he said. "The estate, the accounts, the company shares. It's all mine. Everyone knows it." The certainty in his tone made my stomach twist. He didn't say if. He said it's already settled. It was as though the will hadn't even been read, and yet in his mind, the crown was already on his head. Later, I caught Claire rifling through drawers in Grandfather's library. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled that syrupy smile of hers. "Just looking for old letters," she said. But her hands shook when she closed the drawer. Even my mother, usually the embodiment of silence, slipped one evening at dinner. She raised her glass to David and said, "Soon, you'll be the man of the family." No one contradicted her, not even my father, who stared into his wine as though it might deliver absolution. And yet, I remembered something my grandfather once told me, long before his health declined. He had leaned close, his voice steady, his eyes almost mischievous. "Olivia, things aren't always what they seem. One day, you'll understand what I mean." At the time, I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man nostalgic for secrets. But sitting there, hearing my family toast David's inheritance as if it were scripture, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't just grief hanging in those halls. It was anticipation, entitlement, and something darker, the quiet certainty that they had already won. And I knew then, if Grandfather had left behind even a whisper of choice, it would ignite this family like dry timber meeting a match. The night before the will was to be read, the estate seemed restless. The house groaned with every gust of wind, as if the beams themselves knew a reckoning was near. I walked the halls, unable to sleep, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors like an unwelcome reminder that I didn't belong. In the library, I found an envelope, unsealed, tucked between the pages of an old leather ledger. It wasn't the will itself, but a letter. My grandfather's handwriting unmistakable, angular and deliberate. The words were brief. "Fairness is not always what they demand, Olivia. It is what I decide. Stand tall." I folded it back into the ledger quickly, heart pounding, afraid someone would catch me. What did he mean? Was this his way of preparing me for what was to come, or warning me that the family's definition of fairness had always been poisoned? The air at breakfast was thick with expectation. David strutted about as though the ink on the papers had already dried in his favor. Claire whispered in corners with my mother. My father's hands shook when he poured his coffee, though he tried to disguise it. Even the staff, those who had worked in the house for decades, moved more cautiously like actors aware the next act held disaster. I caught one of them staring at me, then quickly looking away. It was as if they knew something I didn't. And in those moments, the memory of my grandfather's last days came rushing back, the way he'd looked at me with eyes that seemed both tired and determined, the way his hand had lingered on mine longer than anyone else's. The last words he spoke to me, "Don't let them tell you who you are." At the time, I thought it was comfort. Now it felt like instruction. By nightfall, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sense that the script my family had already written for me was about to be ripped apart. Something hidden was waiting to be revealed. And when the curtain finally rose at the reading of the will, none of us, not even me, were prepared for the truth. The will was read the morning after the funeral, in a room that felt more like a courtroom than a sanctuary. Heavy curtains shut out the daylight, leaving only the glow of brass lamps and the weight of family expectation pressing down like a storm cloud. We gathered around the long mahogany table. My father, silent and tight-jawed. My mother, pale but composed. David, leaning back in his chair with the smugness of a king awaiting coronation. Claire, perched like a hawk, watching every flicker of expression, and me, sitting on the edge, the one no one expected to matter. The attorney, Mr. Reynolds, opened the envelope with practiced ceremony. His voice was steady, but the words cracked open our world. To my beloved granddaughter, Olivia Harris, I leave the Harris estate in its entirety. The house, the grounds, the assets therein. A silence followed so sharp, it felt like glass shattering. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. David shot upright. "That's a mistake," he barked, his face crimson. "Read it again." Mr. Reynolds didn't flinch. "The will is clear. The estate is—" Olivia's Claire's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. "This is outrageous. Olivia, she's barely part of this family." My father's voice, cold and controlled, cut through the chaos. "Sit down, Claire." But his hands trembled on the table. My mother turned to me, her eyes soft but heavy with something I couldn't name. Pity maybe, or warning. "Olivia," she whispered, "you don't know what you've just inherited." And then David's fury boiled over. "Number, I won't allow this. Grandfather he couldn't, leave everything to her. She doesn't deserve it." His fist slammed against the table, rattling the glasses. But the lawyer continued reading, his voice almost defiant against the noise. Stipulations about the preservation of the estate, the protections against forced sale, the explicit exclusion of David and Claire. Every word landed like a hammer. By the time Mr. Reynolds finished, the room was unrecognizable. The air pulsed with betrayal. David's eyes burned into me like I had stolen something sacred. Claire whispered venom into his ear, their alliance tightening. I sat frozen, the letter from my grandfather echoing in my mind. Stand tall. But how do you stand tall when your own family is circling, knives out, ready to cut you down? That was the moment I realized. The funeral wasn't the end. It was the beginning. In the hours after the will was read, the Harris estate no longer felt like a home, but a battlefield waiting for the next shot to be fired. Yet I did not fight back. Not yet. David stormed through the halls, demanding meetings with lawyers he hadn't even called. Claire stalked from room to room, whispering venom into whichever ear would listen. My father retreated to his study, locking the door as though the weight of silence could shield him from what had just happened. And me? I walked quietly through the house, my hands brushing against the banister, the walls, the very wood that was now legally mine. Each touch felt both unreal and dangerous, as if I were trespassing in a place I had always been denied. When David confronted me that evening in the parlor, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, I said, "Nothing. You know this isn't yours, Olivia. He wasn't in his right mind. This—" He gestured wildly at the chandelier, the portraits, the grand piano. "This belongs to the family, to me, not to you." I held his gaze, but kept my lips sealed. That silence enraged him more than any argument could have. He left, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Claire came next, her tone dripping with condescension. "Enjoy your little victory. You won't hold on to it, not once the truth comes out." "What truth?" I asked softly. She faltered, just for a second, before regaining her composure. "You'll see." Then she swept out, leaving the question to rot in the air. That night, I sat at my grandfather's desk, staring at the letter I'd found days earlier. Stand tall. But I couldn't. Not yet. Restraint was my only armor. Because I had realized something they hadn't. The louder they raged, the more clearly the cracks in their own positions showed. If I was patient, if I endured, those cracks would widen until the entire edifice of their certainty collapsed on its own. But patience has its price. And in the Harris family, silence was always mistaken for weakness. The next morning, the Harris estate awoke to a new rhythm, one that pulsed with hostility. Breakfast, once a stiff but polite ritual, had turned into a stage for accusation. David arrived late, his tie loose, his expression coiled. He didn't sit. He loomed over the table. "This farce ends today," he declared. "I've already called a lawyer. That won't hold in court." Claire, seated primly beside him, added, "And once the judge hears how you manipulated grandfather, how you preyed on him when he was frail, it will all unravel." Their words struck like stones, yet I swallowed them quietly, my fork motionless on my plate. I wanted to scream that I had done nothing, that my only inheritance until now had been silence and exclusion. But instead, I let the storm pass over me. My father looked up briefly, as if to speak, then lowered his eyes back to the newspaper. My mother stirred her tea with exaggerated calm, refusing to meet my gaze. They would not stand between us. Not yet. Claire leaned forward, her voice dropping into something sharp, almost intimate. "You don't understand what you've stepped into, Olivia. That estate doesn't just hold money, it holds history, power, reputation. Do you really think we'll let you walk off with it?" Her words echoed in the room, mingling with the clink of porcelain. Later that day, I overheard them in the study. David's voice, low but urgent. "We'll push her until she breaks. She's always been weak. If she falters, we'll prove she's unfit to hold the estate. We'll take everything." Claire's reply was colder still. "And if pressure isn't enough, we'll find something. Everyone has a secret, even her." The walls themselves seemed to tighten, their whispers not of family, but of conspiracy. That night, as I stood at the window overlooking the grounds, I realized their strategy wasn't anger anymore. It was siege. They would tighten the circle, cut off my defenses, and drag others into their orbit. Cousins who hadn't visited in years suddenly reappeared, their sympathy suspiciously aligned with David and Claire. Old friends of the family stopped calling, their loyalty quietly bought or threatened away. Every move they made carried the same unspoken message: "You don't belong here. You never did." And yet, for all their plotting, they underestimated one thing: silence does not mean surrender. But before I could decide my next step, the first unexpected ally would arrive, shifting the balance of this family war in a way none of us had foreseen. For days, the house felt like a chessboard where every piece moved against me. David plotting with lawyers, Claire spreading whispers like poison, my parents shrinking into the wallpaper, unwilling to choose sides. I had never felt more alone. Until that Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my grandfather's library, tracing my fingers along the spines of books that smelled of dust and memory, when a voice broke the silence. "You're not crazy, Olivia. You're not alone in this." I turned. It was Aunt Margaret, my mother's quiet sister, the one who rarely spoke above a murmur at family gatherings. To most of us, she was a shadow, always present, but never central. Yet here she stood, her eyes steady, a folded envelope in her hand. "I know what they're saying," she continued, "that you manipulated him, that you don't deserve this house. But I was here, Olivia. I saw how he looked at you, how he trusted you when no one else bothered to visit." She pressed the envelope into my palm. Inside were notes my grandfather had written in the months before his death, entries from a private journal. In them, he spoke of David's arrogance, Claire's greed, the silence of my parents, and he wrote of me. "Olivia understands what this house is meant for, not as a trophy, but as a trust. She will carry it with dignity." My throat tightened as I read his words. For the first time since the will was read, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Margaret leaned closer. "They will come for you with everything they have. But you have this, his words, his truth, and you have me." Her loyalty was a revelation. the forgotten sister, the quiet witness. Suddenly, she was a shield I hadn't expected. And as we sat together in that library, surrounded by the echo of my grandfather's voice in ink and paper, I realized the Harris family was no longer a united front. A crack had formed, not from my silence, but from a voice long ignored, now choosing to speak. The library's walls still hummed with my grandfather's words when the storm arrived in flesh. David barged in, Claire at his side, their footsteps deliberate as thunder. They had heard whispers. News travels fast in this family, especially when betrayal is at stake. "So this is your new strategy?" David sneered. "Hiding behind Margaret? Of all people." Claire's laugh was cold. "She's barely more than a servant in this family. No influence, no respect. And you think her little scribbles in some diary will hold up against the will of the majority?" Margaret stiffened beside me, but her hands did not shake. I wanted to leap to her defense, to shout that those words were proof of grandfather's faith, his last testament beyond lawyers and signatures. But something held me still, a quiet warning that if I lost my temper, their trap would close around me. David leaned across the desk, close enough that I could see the rage flickering in his eyes. "You've always been fragile, Olivia. Easy to provoke, easy to discredit. Do us a favor. Lose control right here, right now. Show everyone who you really are." The air was tight, suffocating, like the whole house was waiting for me to break. Margaret's hand touched mine beneath the desk, the smallest gesture, but enough. I steadied my breath. "I won't," I said quietly. "Not this time." Claire's smile faltered. She had expected a scene, the kind of spectacle that could be replayed in hushed tones around the dinner table. "See? She's unstable. She can't be trusted with an estate, with a legacy." But instead, silence stretched. It was David who cracked first, his voice rising. "You think this is over? Margaret is weak, always has been. We'll dig into her past, into yours, and drag it into court if we have to." That was the moment the housekeeper, Ruth, entered with tea, a figure so ordinary she was nearly invisible. Yet she lingered a second longer than usual, her eyes catching mine, as if to say she had heard every word. In this house, every witness mattered. The confrontation ended not with a victory, but with a promise of war. David and Claire stormed out, the sound of their heels like gunshots against the floorboards. Margaret exhaled slowly. "They will try everything, Olivia. Lies, accusations. They want you to slip, to fail in front of others." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle like a weight in my chest. But for the first time, I had chosen restraint over rage. And in that choice, I sensed power. Still, their threat lingered in the air. They would not stop at whispers or intimidation. They would dig deeper. And in the digging, they might uncover things I hadn't intended anyone to see. By the weekend, Claire had already set her trap. A manila envelope appeared at the breakfast table, slipped across the wood with a smile too sharp to be kind. "Perhaps you'd like to explain this, Olivia," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Inside were photocopies, old medical records, half-forgotten paperwork from years ago, when I had suffered what my doctor once called a nervous episode, a period of sleepless nights, panic attacks, the weight of responsibilities pressing until I collapsed. I had taken leave from work, quietly recovered, and returned stronger. But now, in their hands, it was ammunition. David spoke with mock concern. How can someone with a documented breakdown be trusted to manage millions in assets, let alone preserve grandfather's legacy? The room went still. My parents looked away, shame or fear flickering in their eyes. And suddenly I was no longer just Olivia the granddaughter. I was Olivia the fragile, the unstable, the liability. Margaret rose before I could speak. Her voice, soft but firm, cut through the silence. Do you hear yourselves? You're using illness, healing, as a weapon. Do you know what Harold wrote in his journals, the ones you mocked? He chose Olivia because she understands struggle, because she knows what it means to fall and rise again. That is strength, not weakness. Her words steadied me, but the damage had been done. I could feel it in the way Claire smirked, in the way David leaned back satisfied. They had planted their seed of doubt, not just in the family's eyes, but in mine. That night, alone in my room, I stared at the papers scattered across the bed. They had pulled a chapter of my life I thought was buried, twisting it into something shameful. And as much as I tried to dismiss it, I felt the old tremors creeping back, the doubt, the fear that maybe I was not enough to carry what grandfather had left me. But in the darkness, another thought flickered. If they were willing to dig this deep into me, what secrets lay buried in their past? And what would happen if I started digging too? I could have hidden. I could have let their whispers define me, burying myself under the weight of shame. But Margaret's words haunted me. Falling and rising again is strength. So I rose. The next morning, I returned to my grandfather's study, where Margaret waited with coffee and something fiercer in her eyes than sympathy. "They've dug into you," she said. "Now it's time we see what lies in their shadows." Together, we opened drawers and cabinets that had been left untouched since the funeral, Margaret guiding me to places only she knew. My grandfather had kept records on everything: correspondence, contracts, handwritten notes that cataloged decades of family dealings. It was in a folder labeled innocuously property, East Wing renovation, that the first crack appeared. Receipts and invoices bore David's signature, but the amounts didn't match the completed work. Tens of thousands unaccounted for, funneled through a shell company I had never heard of. Margaret's face tightened. He stole from his own father. Before I could absorb the blow, another discovery landed harder. Claire's name surfaced in letters tucked between property deeds. Correspondence with a lawyer about transferring ownership of a vineyard in France, years before my grandfather's death. She had been maneuvering for assets long before the will was even written. I sat back in the leather chair, the papers trembling in my hands. For years, they had painted themselves as dutiful heirs, guardians of the family name. But beneath the polished veneer was greed, deceit, betrayal deeper than anything I had imagined. The irony was sharp. They had weaponized my past illness, a private wound of survival, while hiding theft in schemes that could shatter everything they pretended to be. By the time I left the study, my resolve had hardened. If they wanted war, I would not fight with outbursts or weakness. I would fight with truth. That evening, during dinner, I slid one of the documents across the table, the inflated invoice with David's signature. The clink of silverware halted. The room hushed. "What is this?" my father asked, his voice low. David's face paled, but he forced a laugh. "Business paperwork. Misfiled." "Misfiled?" I pressed. "Tens of thousands, missing under a company that doesn't exist anymore. Convenient, isn't it?" Claire reached for the paper, but I pulled it back. "And there's more. Letters. Proof that this family's golden couple have been carving pieces of the estate for themselves long before grandfather passed. For the first time, it wasn't me under the weight of suspicion." The eyes around the table turned, sharp and questioning, toward David and Claire. Their polished mask had cracked, and through it, the rot was beginning to show. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was louder than any outburst. And it was only the beginning. The dining room had never felt so quiet, so charged. The paper lay between us like a wound, its black ink screaming louder than any words could. It was my uncle, the quietest of them all, who spoke first. "Is this true, David?" His voice trembled, not from anger, but from something worse. Disappointment. David straightened in his chair, jaw tight, trying to summon the confidence that had always carried him. It's business. Numbers shift. Not everything needs to be paraded like some courtroom drama. But the air had shifted. My cousin, who rarely sided with me, whispered sharply, "So all these years you called Olivia weak, while you were stealing from your own father?" His words cut deeper than any I could have spoken. Claire leaned forward, her eyes glittering, desperate to regain control. "You're letting her manipulate you. She's always been fragile, remember? She's spinning a story to cover her instability." And just like that, the old narrative, the one they thought would save them, was thrown back on the table. But this time, it didn't stick as easily. My father, silent until now, looked at me, really looked at me. His gaze carried both doubt and something softer, the memory of who I was before all this ugliness. Margaret, steady as a stone, spoke next. "The journals told us who Harold trusted. Olivia has proven stronger than you give her credit for. The only ones trembling right now are the guilty." The room cracked open with whispers, shifting glances, alliances reforming in the silence. I saw hesitation in my mother's eyes, as if she was finally questioning the story Claire had been feeding her. My brother, though, leaned closer to David, muttering, "We'll handle this. Don't fold." Enemies and allies were rearranging themselves like pieces on a chessboard. I realized in that moment that this was no longer a battle for money. It was a battle for truth, for legacy, for who would carry the family name forward untainted. But one thing was clear. I was no longer standing alone. For years, I had carried their labels, fragile, unstable, unworthy, as if they were carved into my skin. But that night, in the dining room heavy with silence, I felt something shift inside me. The shame they had sown in me was gone, burned away by the sight of David's pale face and Claire's trembling hands. I stood. My chair scraped back across the polished floor, a sharp sound that cut through their whispers. Every eye turned to me. "You've made me your scapegoat long enough," I said, my voice steady in a way it had never been. "Every flaw, every weakness, you pinned it on me. But the rot has been sitting at this table all along, and it isn't mine." David slammed his palm against the table. "You think you can stand there and accuse me? You're nothing without Harold's pity." I leaned forward, my hands on the table, meeting his rage with calm fire. "I don't need his pity. I have his words, his journals, his trust, and now I have proof." The shock hit the room like a storm. Margaret laid the folder gently in front of me, a silent gesture of support, as though crowning me with evidence. Claire tried to laugh, brittle and hollow. "You expect anyone to believe you, Olivia? You, with your history?" For once, my father didn't flinch at her words. He looked from me to David, then back again, as if scales he hadn't known he carried were finally falling from his eyes. "This isn't about belief anymore," I said. "It's about truth. And truth doesn't need your permission to exist." For the first time since this war had begun, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. The battlefield had shifted, and somewhere deep inside, I knew there would be no turning back. The room no longer felt like a dining hall. It had transformed into a courtroom, a battlefield, a stage where every mask slipped and every hidden wound bled in the open. David rose to his feet, red-faced, pointing at me like a prosecutor. "She's orchestrating this. She's twisting Harold's words. You all know she was never stable. Are we really going to let her rewrite our father's legacy with a stack of scribbles?" I stood taller, holding the journals close to my chest. Scribbles? He wrote these with his own hand, in his own voice, until the day he died. Every entry is a mirror, David, and you don't like what it reflects. Claire banged her fist against the table. Enough! This family has lived on respect and order for generations. You don't get to tear that down with your bitterness, Olivia. Respect? My voice rose, sharper now. Is that what you call it? When you silence me at every turn? When you paint me as broken so no one notices the cracks in your own power? That isn't respect. That's tyranny dressed in Sunday clothes. Margaret stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. I've reviewed Harold's accounts. Money has been drained, siphoned quietly into shell companies. David, I traced the signatures. They're yours. Gasps broke across the table. My brother's face drained of color, and in that instant, the fortress he had built around himself cracked wide open. My father's voice, hoarse and uneven, filled the silence. Tell me it isn't true. David opened his mouth, but no words came. He staggered for an excuse, but every eye on him was a verdict. Claire, desperate, turned on me again. Don't you see what she's doing? She's tearing this family apart. No, I said, my voice lower now but cutting deeper. I didn't tear us apart. You did. Every lie, every theft, every attempt to bury the truth, it was you. All I did was refuse to stay silent. The chandelier above us hummed faintly, its light flickering as if it too felt the tension vibrating through the house. In that moment, the sides became clear. Margaret stood at my shoulder. My cousin moved subtly closer to me. Even my father, shaken and broken, looked less at me and more at David, as though he finally saw the betrayal written across his eldest son's face. For the first time, David looked small. Not the heir, not the untouchable figure he always thought he was. Just a man cornered by his own greed. And the Harris estate, silent witness to decades of tradition and lies, seemed to lean in, waiting for the final blow. The silence after Margaret's revelation felt heavier than the oak beams above us. No one breathed, no one moved. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which foundation would crumble first. David finally spoke, his voice cracked, a man grasping at the last threads of control. I did what I had to do, for this family, for all of us. No, my father whispered, each word trembling as if pulled from the marrow of his bones. You did it for yourself. He pushed back from the table, his chair screeching across the floor. His shoulders sagged, the proud patriarch suddenly stripped of his armor. Claire rushed to David's side, clutching his arm as though sheer force could shield him from the truth. They're twisting this, she pleaded, her voice sharp and desperate. We've held this family together for decades, and you're letting her burn it down. I stepped closer, my voice steady but low, like a hammer striking steel. I'm not burning it down. I'm exposing what was already rotten. The cracks widened. Margaret, usually reserved, declared, The board will have to be notified. The estate, the business, it can't survive under David's name any longer. My father's face contorted with something between grief and rage. He turned on Claire, his longtime confidant. And you knew, didn't you? For the first time, Claire faltered. Her silence was louder than any denial. That was the breaking point. My father sank into his chair, covering his face with both hands. My family, he muttered, a broken man surrounded by the ruins of his own making. My family is nothing but a house of lies. The weight of his words landed hard. In that instant, the Harris family, the dynasty they had guarded like a crown, fractured beyond repair. David's defiance collapsed into fury. If I go down, he spat, I'm taking you all with me. But even his threats rang hollow now. The empire he had claimed as his birthright had already slipped from his grasp. And in that fractured silence, for the first time, I no longer felt like the fragile outsider. I was the only one still standing. The courtroom was not my grandfather's dining room, yet the air felt the same, thick with judgment, history, and the crackle of reputations at stake. I sat at the plaintiff's table, the journals spread like sacred scripture before my attorney. Margaret sat just behind me, a silent sentinel, while David occupied the opposite side, his posture rigid, jaw clenched, as if he could still will the world into submission by sheer force of pride. Claire was beside him, her eyes darting, a mask cracking under the fluorescent lights. The judge entered. A gavel struck. What had once been whispered in drawing rooms and hidden in ledgers was now to be carved into record, permanent and undeniable. Our lawyer spoke with calm authority. Your Honor, this case is about truth long buried. These journals, handwritten by Harold Harris, verified by forensic experts, document the very heart of his estate. They reveal not only his intent, but his betrayal by those closest to him. He laid out the evidence. The bank statements Margaret had unearthed, the forged documents traced back to David's office computer, the pattern of siphoned funds. Piece by piece, a portrait emerged, not of a misunderstood heir, but of a man who had treated his father's legacy like a personal vault. When it was David's turn, his lawyer thundered about loyalty, about family disputes not belonging in courts. But each time the judge's gaze cut through the bluster. Facts outweighed sentiment. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Our expert analyst held up one of the journals, turning to a passage written in Harold's precise hand. If the day comes when my blood turns against itself, let it be Olivia who carries the name forward. She has suffered under our silence, but never bent to it. She will protect what we could not. The words hung in the room like a benediction. Even the court stenographer paused, eyes lifting from the keys. David shot to his feet, shouting, "This is manipulation! She poisoned him against us!" But his voice cracked under the weight of the evidence. His outburst only underscored the collapse already in motion. The judge struck the gavel sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Harris." Hours later, after deliberation, the decision was read. The Harris estate will be placed under the stewardship of Olivia Harris, as per the intent and documented wishes of the late Harold Harris. Furthermore, evidence of financial misconduct will be referred to the district attorney for review. The words echoed like thunder. Claire slumped in her seat. David's face contorted, part fury, part disbelief. My father, who had sat silent throughout, closed his eyes, tears streaming down the lines carved by decades of control. As for me, I felt no triumphal cheer, no Hollywood swell of music, just a quiet exhale, the weight of generations finally lifting from my chest. I had not won riches. I had not won applause. I had won the right to be heard, to carry forward the truth, and that was enough. The verdict was final, the papers signed, the gavel's echo still ringing in my memory. For weeks after, I found myself waking in the middle of the night, uncertain if it had all been a fever dream. But each morning, when I walked through the old Harris estate, the halls once shadowed with whispers and deceit, I felt the truth in every step. The house no longer belonged to David's schemes or Claire's manipulations. It belonged to me, and with that ownership came not wealth or luxury, but responsibility. I began slowly. The portraits of ancestors, once looming like judges on the wall, were rehung with care, each one catalogued. I opened the windows that had been shut for years, letting the wind push out the staleness. The estate's workers, groundskeepers, kitchen staff, even the driver, looked at me cautiously at first, as though unsure if I would be a softer tyrant or a harder one. But I surprised them. I learned their names. I asked about their families. I reinstated wages that David had quietly cut. Within weeks, the air changed. The house no longer felt like a prison. It began to breathe again. The journals became my scripture. I read them late into the night, not just for Harold's words about me, but for the lessons he left behind about sacrifice, about integrity, about what it meant to hold power without letting it poison you. It was not just history. It was a map, showing where they had faltered, where I might tread more carefully. But rebuilding was not only about the house, it was about the family. What remained of it? My father, once a towering figure of control, came to me one afternoon, his steps unsteady, his voice stripped of authority. "I don't know how to be your father anymore," he confessed. His hands trembled, the weight of his complicity finally visible. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the tyrant I had battled for years, but a man hollowed out by pride and grief. "Then start by being honest," I told him. For once. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Margaret became my closest ally. She moved into one of the estate's smaller cottages, refusing any luxury, insisting she only wanted to keep the gardens alive. Together, we formed the Harris Foundation, using what remained of the fortune not for status or politics, but to fund scholarships for students from fractured families, the kind who knew silence more than love. It felt right. It felt necessary. And yet, even as I rebuilt, the cracks of the past lingered. Claire filed appeal after appeal, though each failed. David, stripped of titles and income, vanished from the public eye, whispers of indictments chasing him like storm clouds. Sometimes I would see his face in the paper, worn and furious, and wonder if bitterness was all he had left. For me, though, life was not about bitterness anymore. It was about reclaiming what had been denied. Not jewels, not money, but dignity. I hosted dinners at the estate, not for power brokers or investors, but for neighbors, teachers, and local families who had never been welcomed within its walls. Children's laughter filled the dining hall where silence had once ruled. For the first time in my life, the house felt like a home. There were moments of doubt, late nights when the enormity of what I had inherited pressed down on me. But each time I returned to Harold's words, "Do not measure worth by what you hoard, but by what you dare to give." I was giving now, and in giving, I was healing. It always happens after the dust settles. Once the cameras move on, once the verdict becomes yesterday's headline, that's when the old faces return. Not out of love, but out of hunger. It began with Claire. She appeared at the gates one morning, dressed not in her polished silks, but in something softer, deliberately humble, as if fabric alone could rewrite history. She pressed her hand to the iron bars, calling my name as though we were long-lost sisters. "Olivia, we were family once. Don't let bitterness erase that." But I saw through her performance. The same woman who once orchestrated my silence now clutched at the very legacy she had tried to erase. Then came David, not in anger this time, but in desperation. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. "They've taken everything from me," he pleaded. "I need a chance to rebuild, to start over. I know I was wrong. Just give me something." The words stung, not because they carried truth, but because they mirrored the very pleas I had once whispered, unanswered, in the dark corners of my childhood. The symmetry was cruel, almost theatrical. Even Lisa and Paul appeared, their children in tow, smiling too brightly, speaking of family reunions and fresh beginnings, as though the past could be brushed away like dust from the mantle. They spoke of opportunities, of networking, of how together we could restore the Harris name. But here was the twist. I didn't feel anger. Not anymore. What I felt was clarity. For years, I had been the forgotten branch on the Harris tree, starved of light. Now, with the estate alive again, they circled back like moths to flame. I invited them into the hall, not as kin, but as guests, and I told them plainly, family is not a name carved into stone. It is loyalty proven in silence, in struggle, when no one is watching. You all had that chance, and you chose yourselves. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match we had ever endured. For the first time, it was not me who stood outside looking in. It was them. When the last car pulled away from the estate that evening, taillights fading into the night, I stood alone at the threshold. The halls behind me glowed with warmth. Margaret tending the fire, children from the neighborhood laughing in the kitchen as they decorated cookies. Yet outside, beyond those gates, lingered the ghosts of my family, barred not by iron, but by their own choices. And I realized something. Victory had never been about the gavel's strike or the transfer of deeds. It was about the shift inside me. For years, I had begged to belong, to be seen as part of something larger than myself. Now I understood. Belonging cannot be begged. It must be earned, built through love, loyalty, and truth. The Harris legacy I inherited was not jewels or land, not stocks or titles. It was a test of whether I would repeat their cycle of greed, or whether I would break it. I chose to break it. I poured resources into the foundation, not into boardrooms but classrooms, not into lavish banquets but community meals. The estate, once a fortress of whispers, opened its doors to the very people it had ignored. Each week, I heard laughter echo through the halls, and I thought, this is what legacy should feel like. And here's the truth I want you to take with you. Wealth, whether in dollars or influence or family names, does not change people. It reveals them. My family showed me who they were when I had nothing. They showed me who they were when I had everything. And those lessons cost me dearly, but they gave me clarity no inheritance could buy. So if you've ever felt unseen in your own family, if you've ever wondered whether loyalty is real or just another mask, remember this. You are not defined by who turns their back on you. You are defined by the choices you make when you finally stand on your own. I do not close this chapter with bitterness. I close it with resolve. Because the past was theirs, but the future, it's mine. And maybe if you've stayed with me through this story, you'll take that truth with you too. So tell me, have you ever faced a moment where family revealed who they really were? How did you rise from it? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this journey spoke to you, if it made you see your own life a little clearer, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Because stories like this aren't just mine. They're all of ours. The house behind me is alive again. And so am I.